There are moments in history when a nation's heartbeat can be felt beyond its borders, when a people who have fallen rise again, not through conquest or vengeance, but through grace, precision, and the quiet power of discipline. For Japan, that moment arrived in October 1964. 19 years earlier the country had been reduced to dust. Cities once proud and ancient lay flattened. Children wandered among ruins clutching tin bowls, searching for food that no longer existed. In those early days after surrender, silence filled the air, a silence made of shame and disbelief. The world had seen Japan as an aggressor, a destroyer. The Japanese saw themselves as lost souls in need of purpose. Yet beneath that silence there was movement. In schoolrooms without roofs, teachers wrote lessons on broken blackboards. Farmers returned to fields where nothing grew. In Tokyo, merchants rebuilt stalls from splintered wood and paper. Life, fragile as smoke, began to take shape again. When American occupation forces arrived, led by General MacArthur, they brought rules, rations, and reform. They disbanded the army, rewrote the Constitution, and planted a seed that few understood at first: democracy. It was not an easy transition. Pride had to be dismantled before hope could be rebuilt. But in those years of humiliation, the Japanese people discovered a new strength, not the loud strength of empire, but the quiet strength of perseverance. Factories reopened. Trains rolled again. Women entered the workforce in numbers unseen before. The hunger of a defeated nation turned into the drive of a people determined never to collapse again. And in the small apartments of Tokyo, whispers began to circulate. We will rise not through war but through work. By the mid-1950s, smoke once again rose from chimneys, this time from assembly lines producing radios, cameras, and tiny cars that would soon circle the world. The scars of war remained visible, but something in the national spirit had changed. A new generation was coming of age, one that had not fought but had learned from the ashes. Then, in 1959, a message arrived that would change everything. Tokyo had been chosen to host the 1964 Olympic Games. The announcement came over crackling radios and filled every household with disbelief. The last time Tokyo had been selected, in 1940, the honor had been stolen by war. Now, after 2 decades of rebuilding, Japan would at last welcome the world not as conqueror, but as host. The excitement quickly gave way to fear. Tokyo was not ready. Its roads were narrow, its rivers foul, its skyline still littered with the ghosts of wartime industry. Could a city that had barely learned to stand truly present itself as a symbol of progress? The government decided that the answer must be yes, and so began one of the most ambitious urban transformations of the 20th century. Cranes dotted the horizon. Entire districts vanished overnight, replaced by expressways and glass towers. Workers in white helmets marched through the dawn carrying blueprints and pride in equal measure. For 5 years Tokyo became a living organism, rebuilding itself cell by cell. What had once been a crowded city of bicycles and street markets turned into a futuristic capital of neon lights, bullet trains, and television antennas. The centerpiece of this rebirth was a miracle of engineering, the Shinkansen. Sleek, silver, and silent, it sliced through the countryside at unprecedented speed. To the outside world it was a train. To the Japanese it was proof that their nation had entered the future. Children would press their faces to windows just to see it pass, shouting "Hi-ai, fast," as if speed itself were a new kind of hope. The Olympics, organizers decided, would not only showcase sport but redefine how a country could present itself after tragedy. Every detail mattered, from the design of the torch to the typography on every ticket. A generation of young artists and architects saw their chance to shape Japan's new identity. They embraced minimalism, balance, and modern beauty drawn from tradition. The result was a visual language that whispered rather than shouted. Calm lines, simple colors, perfect form. It was the aesthetic of a nation learning to speak softly again. As construction continued, life in Tokyo pulsed with anticipation. Newspapers printed daily updates. Students volunteered to learn English. Housewives practiced polite greetings for the visitors they imagined would wander their streets. The whole country began to rehearse hospitality. But there was anxiety too. Behind the optimism lingered memories of firebombings, defeat, and surrender. Some worried that opening the doors to the world would reopen wounds not yet healed. Others saw in it the ultimate redemption. The Olympics, they said, would prove that Japan had changed, that its people could build beauty out of ashes. By the summer of 1964, the transformation was nearly complete. Elevated highways curved like ribbons through the skyline. Haneda Airport gleamed with new glass terminals. The city had installed thousands of street signs in English, a small gesture that carried enormous symbolism. Tokyo was ready to speak to the world. As October approached, television crews from every continent arrived, lugging cameras the size of furniture. For the first time, satellites would beam the games live to homes across Europe and America. Humanity would watch together, separated by oceans but connected by light. On the morning of October 10, 1964, the sky above Tokyo was clear and blue. A breeze moved through the flags of 93 nations as 70,000 spectators filled the new national stadium. The seats shimmered with color, white gloves, bright kimonos, military uniforms, and the simple shirts of factory workers who had saved for months to be there. At the center of the stadium stood a young man holding the Olympic torch. His name was Yoshinori Sakai. He was 20 years old, a university student, born in Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945, the day the atomic bomb fell. His selection as final torchbearer carried a message understood by every person watching. From the ashes of destruction, a new light rises. As Sakai climbed the steps and touched the flame to the cauldron, the stadium erupted in applause that rolled like thunder through the city. For a single instant, history folded in on itself. The same country that had once burned now offered its flame to the world as a symbol of peace. The games had begun. Across Tokyo, televisions flickered to life. In Europe, families gathered around screens late into the night, watching the same images broadcast by satellite across half the planet. For the first time in history, humanity shared a collective heartbeat. The events unfolded with precision and grace. Swimmers cut through water that shimmered under new floodlights. Gymnasts soared with quiet concentration. The sound of starting pistols echoed against the polished walls of brand-new arenas. The Japanese hosts managed everything with a meticulous calm that amazed foreign reporters. Punctuality became a kind of poetry. For many, it was the first time they had seen Japan as something other than a memory of war. Here was a nation clean, efficient, and kind. Athletes spoke of the volunteers who bowed before them, of bus drivers who refused to take tips, of children who handed them paper cranes for luck. Even the smallest gestures seemed to tell a story, the story of a people determined to show the world their best selves. The contests themselves were magnificent. American swimmer Don Scollander dominated the pool, winning 4 gold medals and setting world records that would stand for years. His youth and modesty made him a symbol of a new Olympic ideal. In gymnastics, the Japanese men's team faced the mighty Soviets in a duel of precision and endurance. When Yukio Endo nailed his final routine, the crowd exploded, not only because he had won, but because in his calm, perfect movements they saw the reflection of their own reborn nation. Elsewhere, legends were born. Ethiopia's Abebe Bikila, who had run barefoot to victory in Rome, returned to defend his marathon title. This time he wore shoes, yet his stride remained effortless. Through the long streets of Tokyo he ran without expression, his breathing measured, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He crossed the finish line alone, serene, the first man ever to win back-to-back Olympic marathons. When asked how he felt, he simply said, "I feel as if I have won for all of Africa." There were moments of heartbreak too, falls, failures, and injuries that reminded everyone that greatness is born from risk. But the tone of the games was never cruel. Victors lifted rivals from the ground. Spectators applauded every effort, not just victory. The world seemed, for those 2 weeks, to rediscover its humanity. Tokyo 1964 was also a triumph of technology. Electronic timing replaced the fallible eye of referees. Slow-motion replays revealed the beauty hidden in motion. A diver spinning through air like a fragment of silk, a runner's foot touching the line at the instant of victory. For the first time, sport was not only witnessed but studied, revered, almost spiritualized. And through it all, Tokyo itself shone like a character in the story, a city reborn. Neon reflected on clean streets. Trains slid like silver arrows through the night. The once scarred skyline now glittered with hope. Visitors from abroad wrote home about a country unlike any they had imagined. Courteous, ordered, dazzlingly modern. As the games unfolded, it became clear that what Japan had achieved went far beyond medals. It had rebuilt its soul. As the first days of competition passed, something extraordinary began to unfold. The games were no longer simply an exhibition of athletic skill. They had become a mirror in which the world could see Japan's transformation. Each medal ceremony, each bow of respect, each handshake between rivals added a new brushstroke to a portrait of dignity. Foreign journalists noticed it immediately. "The Japanese," wrote one reporter, "compete as if every movement carries the weight of history." And perhaps it did. For behind every perfectly timed race and every disciplined routine lay 2 decades of collective effort, a nation's silent promise to redeem itself through excellence. At the swimming pool, Don Scolander continued his golden streak, his lean frame cutting through the water with machine-like rhythm. Yet even he seemed humbled by the meticulous courtesy of his hosts. When interviewed, he said softly, "It feels like the whole city is cheering for everyone." In that single sentence he captured the essence of the Tokyo Games, a sense that competition and compassion could coexist. Meanwhile, on the gymnastics floor, the Japanese men's team faced pressure unlike any other. The Soviet Union had dominated the sport for years, and victory for Japan would mean more than national pride. It would mean cultural parity. The routines were elegant, restrained, yet filled with power. Yukio Endo's final dismount brought the crowd to its feet. When the scores appeared, gold for Japan, the roar was deafening. Tears streamed down the faces of spectators who had lived through the war. In Endo's composure they saw not arrogance, but peace reclaimed. Across the city, in smaller arenas and humble training halls, stories unfolded that would never make global headlines but lived on in memory. Young judokas bowed before stepping onto the mat for the first Olympic judo competition in history. For Japan it was a homecoming. The world had adopted a martial art once used to train samurai. 3 Japanese champions stood victorious, embodying centuries of discipline. Yet in the open-weight final, the towering Dutchman Anton Geesink faced Japan's Akio Keminaga. The crowd held its breath. When Geesink executed a perfect throw and won, silence fell. Then, to the astonishment of all, spectators began to applaud. They applauded the foreigner who had mastered their art. In that gesture Japan showed the world it had learned the deepest lesson of all: respect transcends victory. Technology buzzed behind the scenes. Seiko engineers monitored experimental quartz timers accurate to hundredths of a second. Cameras captured images sharper than anything broadcast before. Producers directed satellite feeds through the newly launched Syncom 3 satellite, a marvel that linked Tokyo to California in real time. For many viewers, it was the first live image they had ever seen from the other side of the planet. A young boy in London watching on his family's black and white television saw Japan for the first time and would later say it changed his idea of the world. The Japanese press called it Sekai no Manazashi, the gaze of the world. For the first time, Japan was not being watched with fear or pity but with admiration. Each flawless train schedule, each clean street, each polite smile became part of the story. The games were proof that order and empathy could coexist, that precision could have a human face. Culturally, Tokyo vibrated with contrast. Ancient temples stood beside futuristic architecture. Street vendors sold noodles under new neon signs. Foreign visitors marveled at the politeness of taxi drivers who bowed before pulling away, at the students eager to practice English, at the small gifts left in hotel rooms, paper cranes, calligraphy, tokens of welcome. The nation's aesthetic, refined, modest, meticulous, seeped into every aspect of the games. The Japanese organizers had designed everything to tell a story of harmony. The Olympic emblem, 5 interlocking rings above a simple red sun, merged global unity with national identity. The posters, the uniforms, even the ticket stubs shared a restrained beauty that seemed almost meditative. For a world accustomed to Cold War propaganda, this quiet elegance was refreshing. The competitions continued with breathtaking drama. Soviet gymnast Boris Shaklin performed with mechanical perfection, yet when he saluted Endo at the end of the meet, both men smiled like old friends. American sprinter Bob Hayes exploded down the track to win the 100 meters in record time, his power almost frightening. In the marathon, as Abebe Bikila crossed the line, television commentators fell silent. Words seemed inadequate. He bowed his head slightly, his expression serene, and for a heartbeat the entire planet seemed to breathe with him. Outside the stadiums, Tokyo's rhythm never slowed. Bullet trains hummed between cities, carrying spectators who watched fields of rice blur into silver speed. Shops displayed televisions broadcasting the very events their customers were attending. For Japanese citizens, technology had ceased to be foreign. It had become part of their identity. And then there was the atmosphere, the feeling that something greater than sport was unfolding. One American journalist wrote, "These games feel like an apology and a promise at once." But to the Japanese they were neither. They were a declaration that the country's spirit could evolve. The word on everyone's lips was kibo, hope. Day by day, medal by medal, the narrative deepened. Children waved flags on street corners. Factory workers gathered around transistor radios during lunch breaks. Elderly women in rural villages clapped at the sound of Japan's national anthem echoing from distant televisions. The games had unified a country in ways politics never could. Foreign leaders noticed. Diplomats who once treated Japan with cautious distance now spoke of partnership. Trade agreements accelerated. Cultural exchanges blossomed. The Olympics had done in weeks what years of diplomacy could not. They had made Japan trusted again. Within the athletes' village, friendships flourished. Letters exchanged between competitors after the games reveal a warmth that defied language. A Kenyan runner wrote to his Japanese roommate, "Your discipline taught me peace." A Czech gymnast sent a note that simply read, "When I think of your country, I think of silence before dawn." These were the quiet echoes of a revolution not fought with weapons, but with grace. Yet beneath the triumph there were whispers of exhaustion. The cost of progress had been immense. Families displaced by redevelopment watched the celebrations from afar, uncertain whether the new Tokyo still belonged to them. Small businesses vanished under highways. Cultural critics feared that the relentless push for modernity was erasing something uniquely Japanese: the intimacy of wooden houses, the sound of rain on tatami mats. Progress, as always, demanded sacrifice. But for most, the balance seemed worth it. Every evening as the city lights flickered on, Tokyo glowed with pride. Street vendors called out to foreigners in halting English. Trains ran to the second. The air carried the scent of both incense and gasoline. The old and the new coexisted in fragile harmony, like two hands joined across time. By the second week, the games had become a global obsession. Newspapers from New York to Nairobi ran front-page stories about Japan's efficiency. Commentators compared the event to a symphony, every movement perfectly timed, every note in tune. The Japanese word ganbaru, meaning to give one's best, echoed across headlines. The world had discovered a new vocabulary of discipline. As the competitions drew toward their end, Tokyo began to exhale. The streets that had vibrated with tension now filled with laughter. Athletes roamed markets buying souvenirs, marveling at the courtesy that followed them everywhere. Local children offered them origami cranes, small symbols of peace that seemed to capture the very essence of the games. In the closing days, the marathon traced its course through a city transformed. Crowds lined the route 10 deep, waving flags and shouting encouragement in dozens of languages. When the final runner entered the stadium, the applause was as loud as for the winner. For 2 weeks the world had learned that respect could be louder than triumph. When the closing ceremony arrived, the stands overflowed. The imperial family took their seats as the sun dipped low. Athletes entered together rather than by nation, mingling freely, an idea first proposed in Tokyo and later adopted as an Olympic tradition. Flags intertwined, and for a moment borders dissolved. The music swelled, and people who had once faced each other on battlefields now danced side by side. As the Olympic flame flickered and dimmed, the crowd stood in silence. Many wept, not out of sadness but gratitude. They had witnessed more than sport, they had witnessed renewal. When the final ember died, fireworks painted the night sky, illuminating a city that had proved the impossible. A nation destroyed by war had rebuilt itself through peace. The following morning, Tokyo awoke to a new identity. Streets were quiet again, but beneath the calm ran a hum of confidence. Newspapers declared the games a triumph. Foreign reporters described them as flawless, graceful, a masterpiece of organization. The phrase that appeared most often was simple: Japan has returned. Factories resumed work, inspired by the same precision that had guided the Olympics. Engineers who had designed timing systems moved on to create the world's most accurate watches. Urban planners used Olympic maps to expand highways and public transit. The games had ended, but their momentum continued. The infrastructure built for 2 weeks of sport became the backbone of a new era of prosperity. Economists would later call the next 20 years Japan's economic miracle. Yet those who lived through it knew the miracle had begun not in boardrooms or factories, but in the hearts of people who had believed in 1964. The discipline of athletes became the discipline of workers. The elegance of ceremonies became the elegance of design. The Olympic spirit seeped into every aspect of life. Beyond Japan's borders, the impact was equally profound. Asian nations saw in Tokyo a model for their own modernization. Western countries, once wary, now sought partnership. The phrase "made in Japan," once a mark of inferiority, began to signify excellence. The Olympics had rewritten the world's vocabulary of trust. But even as prosperity blossomed, Japan faced a new question. What did it mean to be modern without forgetting the past? In the rush toward progress, many feared the loss of tradition, the quiet gardens, the tea houses, the slow grace of calligraphy. Artists and poets began to speak of balance, of finding beauty not in perfection but in harmony. The spirit of the 1964 Games, disciplined yet humble, became the guiding ideal for a generation. Photographs from that autumn capture more than events, they capture emotion. A child waving at a parade of foreign athletes. A volunteer bowing as he collects litter from the stadium floor. A line of cyclists passing under banners of peace. Each image is a fragment of a larger truth, that the human spirit, once broken, can rebuild itself with gentleness. When historians look back, they see that Tokyo 1964 marked the beginning of the global era, an age of television, technology, and shared experience. It showed that sport could connect humanity not through dominance but through empathy. It redefined victory itself. For Japan, the Games were both an ending and a beginning. The wounds of war could never be erased, but they could be transformed into lessons. The humility born of defeat became the foundation of success. The flame that Yoshinori Sakai lit did not burn out, it became part of Japan's soul. As autumn faded into winter, the city returned to its routines, but something invisible lingered in the air, a sense of unity that could not easily be described. People walked a little taller, spoke a little softer, worked a little harder. They had seen what they could be together, and they would not forget it. Tokyo 1964 had rebuilt not just a nation but a way of seeing the world. Years passed, but the memory of those 2 October weeks never faded. For many Japanese, the Games were not simply an event from history, they were a moment when everything changed. They were the bridge between a painful past and a luminous future, between destruction and dignity. Children who had watched the flame burn in 1964 grew up to become engineers, artists, and teachers. They carried that memory with them, the memory of a city united, of a nation standing tall again. For them, the words Tokyo 1964 did not just name an Olympics, they named a rebirth. In the decades that followed, Japan's transformation astonished the world. The bullet train became faster, smoother, quieter. Skyscrapers climbed into the clouds. Automobiles, electronics, and film cameras bearing the names Sony, Toyota, and Canon filled store shelves across continents. The West, once skeptical, now looked eastward with admiration and curiosity. But prosperity is never simple. As Japan became an economic superpower, a new challenge emerged: how to balance progress with soul. Some wondered if the relentless efficiency that had dazzled the world was beginning to erase the very humanity that had inspired it. Streets once filled with song and laughter became corridors of commuters. Neon lights replaced the glow of lanterns. The poetry of stillness, so central to Japanese identity, seemed at risk of vanishing. And yet, beneath the hum of machines, that poetry endured. It lived in tea houses tucked behind skyscrapers, in temple gardens where the air still smelled of pine and incense, in the small kindnesses of everyday life. The spirit of 1964 had never truly been about modernity, it had been about harmony, about proving that a nation could rebuild without losing its soul. In the years after the Games, Japan's leaders often spoke of Olympic spirit as a philosophy. Not the pursuit of victory at all costs, but the pursuit of excellence with humility. Schools taught it. Companies adopted it. It became part of the invisible architecture of the country, the quiet rhythm of collective purpose. Meanwhile, the rest of the world changed. The Cold War deepened. Nations raced to the moon. Television expanded, spreading not just news but dreams. The seeds planted in Tokyo, the idea of a shared global moment, began to bloom everywhere. The Olympics themselves would never be the same again. From that point forward, they were not only contests of power, but celebrations of unity, diversity, and peace. For many historians, Tokyo 1964 marked the birth of the modern Olympics. Everything that came after, the grandeur of Los Angeles 1984, the spectacle of Beijing 2008, the inclusivity of London 2012, carried echoes of Tokyo's quiet perfection. The standard had been set. Yet to understand what made those games truly timeless, one must look beyond medals and architecture. One must look at the small stories, the kind that never appear on official lists. Like the volunteer who stood in the rain to guide lost visitors back to their hotels. Or the worker who spent entire nights polishing railings so that foreign guests would see them shine. Or the schoolgirl who watched Yoshinori Sakai light the flame and whispered to herself that she would one day help build a better Japan. It is in these details, in these moments of ordinary grace, that the true meaning of Tokyo 1964 lives on. Years turned into decades. Generations changed. The world saw Japan face earthquakes, recessions, and the tragedy of Fukushima. Each time the nation rebuilt, quietly, precisely, with that same endurance born from the ashes of the past. The legacy of 1964 was not just the infrastructure or the medals. It was the belief that no matter how deep the destruction, renewal was always possible. In 2020, 56 years after Yoshinori Sakai's flame first lit the sky, the Olympics returned to Tokyo. But this time the world was different. A virus had silenced stadiums, emptied streets, and separated families. The stands that once thundered with applause now stood quiet. And yet, when the torch was lit again, carried by healthcare workers and ordinary citizens, the message felt familiar. Hope had returned. People watching from their homes around the world felt a strange echo. They remembered those old black and white images of 1964, the same city, the same discipline, the same resilience. It was as if history had looped back to remind humanity that the flame of perseverance never dies. The 2020 Games, though subdued, carried the same essence that had defined Japan for generations. Grace under pressure, strength without noise, progress without arrogance. The cycle had completed itself. The spirit of 1964 had come home. To understand Tokyo 1964 is to understand what it means to rebuild. Rebuilding is not merely constructing walls or roads. It is rebuilding trust, rebuilding faith, rebuilding the will to believe in beauty after ruin. It is the quiet decision, repeated millions of times, to keep moving forward even when the path ahead is uncertain. Japan taught the world that redemption is not a gift, it is a craft. It is built with the hands of those who refuse to surrender, with the hearts of those who find purpose in precision, with the souls of those who bow not in defeat, but in respect. Every nation has its defining story, the tale it tells when the lights go out and the doubts return. For Japan, that story begins in 1964 with a torch carried by a boy from Hiroshima, a city once erased from maps, now illuminating the entire world. The images remain vivid even now. The rising sun over the stadium. The white-gloved volunteers lined in perfect rows. The bullet train gliding like a silver arrow through rice fields. The stadium erupting as athletes bowed to one another in mutual respect. And the sound, not of explosions but of applause. That was the music of rebirth. If you listen carefully, you can still hear it today in the hum of a Tokyo morning, in the rhythm of trains, in the footsteps of commuters crossing Shibuya's endless intersection. The games may have ended long ago, but their spirit runs through every heartbeat of the city. Tokyo has changed, and yet, in some profound way, it has not. The discipline that shaped the games still shapes the people. The humility that guided those volunteers still guides strangers helping one another on crowded platforms. The perfection once displayed on the gymnastics floor now lives in the design of a phone, the reliability of a train, the silence of a temple at dusk. What began as an effort to rebuild reputation became something much greater, a meditation on what it means to be human after loss. The story of Tokyo 1964 is the story of balance. Between the old and the new. Between sorrow and celebration. Between the need to remember and the courage to move on. It reminds us that greatness is not found in victory, but in restoration. When the world watched Japan rise, it learned a lesson that still matters today, that the most powerful nations are not those that conquer but those that endure. That the brightest light often comes from the place that once knew the deepest darkness. In every generation the Olympic flame is lit anew. It burns not for records but for renewal, for the belief that the human spirit, no matter how broken, can shine again. And perhaps that is why Tokyo 1964 continues to resonate. Because it was not about Japan alone. It was about all of us. It was proof that civilization can heal itself, that progress can coexist with peace, that even in a divided world, unity is possible. When the final credits of that story roll, when the last echo of applause fades into memory, one image remains. A young man from Hiroshima standing before the world, holding a flame that defies extinction. The light trembles in his hands, but it does not falter. He lifts it higher. The crowd holds its breath. And as the fire leaps into the air, illuminating the night, you realize that this is not just Japan's story, it is humanity's. The camera pans out. The stadium glows like a second sun. Beyond it, the city stretches toward the horizon, alive with movement, with purpose, with hope. And somewhere in the hush that follows, you can almost hear a whisper, quiet, humble, resolute. We have rebuilt.